Vanderdunk's central contribution was his legal and political campaign against the autocratic rule of Director General Peter Stuyvesant and the Dutch West India Company that Stuyvesant represented. Dutch-style religious toleration, and used his knowledge to actively promote immigration to the colony. Welcome back, everyone, to the Moneyball Method podcast. This is Mark Shoup, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. Over the past several weeks, we've been going back in history to talk about venture capital, private investment, new inventions and innovations that have changed and improved our lives drastically, beginning with the 21st century and then into the 19th, 18th, and 17th century. And that's where I'm going to pick up today, the 1600s. More specifically, today I will be discussing the English, French, and Dutch settlements in the American colonies and Quebec during the 1600s. In particular, the Virginia Company's investment in Jamestown, the French monarchy's attempt to corner the fur trade in Quebec, the London merchants' adventures in Massachusetts, and the Dutch West India Company's investment in the island at the center of the world, Manhattan. And like last week, when I identified the great venture capitalist and Jewish immigrant from Poland, Haim Salomon, as the unsung hero of the American Kinetic Revolution, today I will identify the great legal mind from the Netherlands, Adrian Vanderdonk, as the unsung hero of the American Social Revolution. But to begin, we'll go to Jamestown, Virginia, the year 1607. The Virginia Company of London sent out its first expedition to begin colonizing Virginia and arrived in Chesapeake Bay in April 1607, and it included 105 men. This was funded by a joint stock company that received its royal charter in 1606 and was funded by private investors. King James I gained access to natural resources and native tribes for conversion to the Anglican religion for England, and investors got protection from catastrophic losses. The combination of limited liability with the promise of rich returns made joint stock companies an appealing investment for England's growing merchant class, and the companies raised huge sums of money beginning in the early 1600s. Many of the settlers were the younger sons of elite families who could not inherit property claimed by their older brothers in England. This mission also brought skilled workers from other parts of Europe, including craftsmen from Poland and Germany. In 1608, the second supply arrived, including the first two women known to have come to the Jamestown colony. They were Mistress Forrest and Anne Burris, her maid. The third supply arrived in 1609 with the largest fleet. In all, there were 500 settlers, including John Rolfe, the future husband of Pocahontas. And over the next 18 years, the Virginia Company democratized its governance and reformed its financial model. What began as an enterprise of investors seeking a dividend was funded a decade later almost exclusively by a private lottery. And by 1618, the company had found a way to use its most abundant resource, land, to tempt settlers to pay their own passage from England to the colony, and then after arrival, pay the company a fee to use their land. I think one lesson we can learn from this is the resilience and creativity of the investors as they encountered the natural wild environment of the new world and adjusted their financial models and their governance accordingly. And then in 1608, there was Quebec. The first permanent settlement of the New France Company was established by an expedition led by Samuel de Champlain. But that was funded by a royal fur trade monopoly that actually began in 1603 by his superior Pierre Duguay de Mons. In addition, Cardinal Richelieu promised land parcels to hundreds of new settlers and aimed to turn Canada into an important mercantile and farming colony. He named Champlain as the governor of New France, and he forbade non-Catholics from living there. In 1611, Quebec sponsors abandoned the colony due to the heavy losses in the fur trade, and the king made Champlain commandant of New France in 1613 and reestablished his authority in Quebec. Only beaver furs actually kept the company alive, however, and a decade after its founding, there were only 50 permanent settlers making their home in Quebec City, a cluster of hastily constructed buildings with wharfs and sheds on the water. The investment granted by monopoly by the King of France was not working out so well. Moving into 1620, we have the establishment of the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. In September of 1620, the Mayflower embarked on its famous voyage to America, carrying 102 passengers and around 30 crew. In essence, the Pilgrims sold themselves to the London merchant adventurers, what a great name that is, who agreed to fund the voyage in exchange for the colonists' labor. They were indentured servants by their own choice. Agreeing to work for the company for 7 years, the Pilgrims sent fur, lumber, and other valuable goods to repay their English investors during their first years in America. All profits from all work belonged to the investors, and no land would be assigned to any colonists during the 7 years, as they would live communally on company land. Communal living didn't work out so well. In the fall of 1620, the ship named Fortune was the second English ship destined for Plymouth colony, and it transported 35 settlers. And in 1623, the third and fourth ships of the merchant adventurers traveled to North America in support of Plymouth colony, and between them, the ships brought about 90 new settlers. But it was really the great Puritan migration of the 1630s that we know about and have heard the most stories, and that was financed better than the Pilgrims. They obtained a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they were largely self-funded through the sale of property in England. In other words, they had skin in the game, and it was not their own skin, as the Pilgrims had pledged, and that was supplemented by a joint stock structure among wealthier Puritan investors in England. In summary, regarding those three colonies, there was the French fur trade monopoly in Quebec, led by Samuel de Champlain, that limited itself to the Catholic religion. And we had the settlements in New England, funded by private capital, and were dominated by Puritan fundamentalists and their communal property laws. Thirdly, we had the Virginia colony. It was originally backed by 1,700 shareholders in Europe and was committed to the Anglican religion. At this point, I would like to ask, do you think the radical achievement of Americanism, of rights, liberty, and justice would have been possible in this cocktail of religious ideologies, all competing for the hearts and minds of native tribes? I do not. There had to be a better way. There had to be another colony with another model, with different principles, a different philosophy, and that was New Amsterdam, established by the Dutch in 1624. Funded by the Dutch West India Company, New Netherlands encompassed what is now New York, Delaware, Maryland, and Connecticut, and New Jersey. This was a state-sponsored trading corporation that was primarily interested in the fur trade. However, it actually began with Henry Hudson on September 2nd, 1609, when his ship, the Half Moon, sailed into New York Harbor. It anchored near Staten Island, and for the next 5 weeks, Hudson and his crew of 16 men explored the river that now bears his name. They traveled approximately 150 miles northward, making contact with Native Americans, and recorded their observations that would eventually lead to the colonization of New Netherland by the Dutch and the West India Company. Hudson's favorable report on the richness of the land and the opportunity for a prosperous fur trade inspired the Dutch to form a new company, and the Dutch West India Company established their first permanent fur trading post near modern-day Albany, New York, in 1614. And in 1625, the Dutch West India Company established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. But really, this story takes great importance in 1641. This is when the attorney, the lawyer from Leiden in the Netherlands, Adrian van der Dunk, was appointed sheriff and prosecutor for the region near Albany that was owned by Kilian van Rensselaer. Most importantly, he was the first lawyer in the Dutch colony, and he became a leader in the political life of New Amsterdam. As a reward for negotiating peace with American Indian tribes, the Dutch West India Company later gifted van der Dunk his land north of Manhattan. There he became known as the Jonker, meaning a gentleman in Dutch, from which the modern city of Yonkers was named. Van der Dunk's central contribution was his legal and political campaign against the autocratic rule of Director General Peter Stuyvesant and the Dutch West India Company that Stuyvesant represented. In 1648 and 1649, van der Dunk prepared the Remonstrance of New Netherland. In it, he accused the Dutch West India Company of mismanagement and urged the government to recall Stuyvesant. Not only did he plead for better government and the policies that would encourage immigration, van der Dunk predicted that without special assistance from the Dutch government, the New Netherlands settlement would utterly fall off and pass under foreign rule. It did. Van der Dunk also wrote The Description of New Netherland, which remains the most detailed account of the Dutch colony, its geography, indigenous peoples, and prospects. Charles Gehring, director of the New Netherland Institute, called it the fullest account of the province and said that if it had not been written in Dutch, it would have gone down as one of the great works of American colonial literature. In his 2000 book, The Island at the Center of the World, author Russell Shorto wrote that van der Dunk's character and actions were important to the development of the American spirit and labeled him a forgotten American patriot. Adrian van der Dunk was one of the earliest advocates of a republican system of government for the New World, Dutch-style religious toleration, and used this knowledge to actively promote immigration to the colony. In summary, the Americanism of free trade, liberal immigration, religious tolerance, and representative government may never have occurred without the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam and the moral and intellectual courage of Adrian van der Dunk. In fact, his Remonstrance of New Netherland stands as one of the earliest formal demands by colonists in North America for self-governance and elected officials who are subordinate to their citizens. And that is my summary of the colonization of the American colonies in the 17th century, which ultimately led to the Great Experiment, the idea that we know as America and rights, liberty, and justice. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you next week.